In this lecture, we will review the major candidates for oldest fossil hominin. These fossils are the oldest that may be members of our own lineage, and they are of interest because they exhibit traits that suggest they were bipedal. These primates lived around 5 to 7 million years ago and are known mainly from East Africa. Remember that the Miocene ended around 5 million years ago, and that the Pliocene began at this time. So the earliest hominins, that's the tribe Hominini, emerged around the end of the Miocene epoch. You can see this branch of the hominin phylogeny on the lower right of this image. The first hominins are found in lakeshore and cave deposits in Africa. We'll start our survey of the human fossil record by looking at the very first hominins, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus, which lived between 4 and 7 million years ago. Some researchers are not convinced that these earliest hominins even are hominins. The reason is that we move back in time, or as we move back in time to the last common ancestor with chimpanzees and gorillas, the differences between these lineages becomes less and less obvious, and eventually the lineages merge into a single last common ancestor. The fact that we aren't entirely sure as to which lineages these early possible hominins belong to is very strong evidence for our common ancestry with apes. As is shown in the map on this second slide in the lecture, most species we'll discuss are found along the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, from Ethiopia through Kenya and into Tanzania. Another large contingent of hominin species are found in cave deposits in South Africa, and we'll talk about those in a later lecture. In northern Tanzania, in East Africa's Great Rift Valley, lies Olduvai Gorge, one of the most famous early human fossil sites ever discovered. For decades, the husband and wife team of Mary and Louis Leakey scoured the barren hillsides under an intense equatorial African sun, searching for the remains of our ancestors. For almost 30 years, they searched and found many ancient animal remains and stone tools, but no bones of the actual tool makers. And why did they spend so much effort in this desolate landscape? Because, like all of us, they wanted to know who we are as a species and how we came to be the way we are. Eventually, their work paid off with the discovery of dozens of fossils of early human ancestors or relatives, or hominins, including the remarkably complete skull of a creature known as a robust Australopithecine. In 1959, Mary Leakey discovered the skull of what they then called Zinjanthropus and nicknamed Nutcracker Man because of the large teeth. We later came to rename this skull Australopithecus or Paranthropus, and it's a robust Australopithecine. Louis Leakey had been searching for the remains of an early hominin for 29 years when Mary made this discovery. He was actually ill with malaria and back at camp when she made the actual discovery. Along the way, though, the Leakey team found many artifacts in the form of stone tools and the fossil remains of extinct animals that lived alongside hominins at Olduvai. Following in his parents' footsteps, Richard Leakey has also risen to the status of a famous paleoanthropologist. His wife Meave is equally accomplished, and their daughter Louise is currently the principal investigator of the research project, which is now in Kenya. If you look back at chapter 8 in your textbook, there is a discussion of the dating methods that paleoanthropologists use. We won't go into as much detail on dating as you would in an archaeology class, but I would like to note the major differences in two types of dating that are often used in paleoanthropological contexts. These two types of dating are used in different geographical regions, and their use is significant because they differ in regards to their accuracy. Absolute dating is more accurate than relative dating, and like it sounds, enables us to provide an absolute date. This type of dating can be used where one finds evidence of volcanic activity, like East Africa, so that the dates here are more precise. Relative dating methods are less precise and are used more often in southern and western Africa. Relative dating entails using a method like faunal correlation to provide a date that's an estimate based on or relative to the fauna found in one site, like South Africa, and compared to the fauna in geographical areas like East Africa that allow us to use absolute methods. There is a correlation between the faunal assemblage or species between the two sites. The absolute date of one site is then used to make an estimate for the other site, and a larger range of dates is provided rather than a narrow date estimate like you can have with absolute dating, also called chronometric dating. In 2001, a French team led by Michel Brunet made a phenomenal discovery, a skull unlike any seen before. It had a small ape-sized brain of about 350 cubic centimeters, or cc's, and a very large brow ridge like that found on a male gorilla. But it also had a rather flat, somewhat human-like face with a relatively small canine that was non-honing, like that found in hominins, so derived traits. Furthermore, the position of the foramen magnum was towards the bottom of the skull, suggesting that this creature may have been able to move on two legs. This fossil was dated using biostratigraphy, a relative method, and later using radiometric dating, an absolute method. And the dates came up as between 6 and 7 million years of age. The many other fossils found in the vicinity allowed a reconstruction of a quite forested environment for this hominin, if it was indeed a hominin. But what is this thing? The discoverers named it Sahelanthropus chadensis and argued that the small apically worn canine and position of the foramen magnum indicate that it is a hominin because these are derived traits in our tribe. Other researchers note the gorilla-like brow ridge and attachment for neck and chewing musculature as evidence that it may be an ancestral African ape, because these are more primitive or ancestral traits. Given the combination of ape-like or ancestral and hominin-like or derived traits, it could very well show us what a last common ancestor of humans and African apes looked like. As more fossils are discovered, especially fossils of the postcranial skeleton, scientists may be able to determine with much more accuracy how Sahelanthropus moved and whether indeed it is a hominin or an ancient ape. Of course, it could be a common ancestor of both. Another fossil that has laid claim to the title of earliest hominin was discovered in the Tugan Hills of Kenya by a French paleontological team led by Martin Pickford and Brigitte Senou. They did not find a skull, as the Sahelanthropus team found in Chad. Instead, they found a femur and a few other species of the dentition and postcranial skull of a very interesting 6 million year old possible hominin they named Auroran tuganensis. The femur, shown in the upper right image of this slide, has a long neck and a groove in the back of the neck called an obturator externus groove. Both of these features are found in modern human femora and are functionally related to our upright walking. This femur, therefore, belonged to something most likely walking on two legs. However, the hand bones are long and curved, meaning that though bipedal on the ground, Auroran climbed trees, which is consistent with other fossils discovered nearby, indicating they lived in a forest. The canines of Auroran are rather large, though not as large as an ape's, and they do exhibit some honing. For over a decade now, researchers have wondered about the hominin status of Sahelanthropus and Auroran. Some regard them as hominins, others do not. Part of the problem is that these fossil animals are quite fragmentary. An additional problem is one already mentioned. As we near the last common ancestor of humans and the African apes, the anatomical differences between these lineages will get less and less obvious, making it exceedingly difficult to tell whether a fossil creature like Sahelanthropus or Auroran belongs on one lineage or another, or both, or neither. In the last decade and a half, scientists from the Middle Awash Project in Ethiopia have been scouring the ancient landscapes, like the one shown here, finding remarkable fossils of some of the earliest possible hominins. Their discoveries are of a creature called Ardipithecus. These are fossils of a quite old type of this animal, dated 5.2 to 5.8 million years ago, called Ardipithecus cadaba. There are also fossils from a more recent species that lived 4.4 million years ago, called Ardipithecus ramidus. Ramidus is best known for a remarkable skeleton of an adult female individual announced to the world in 2009. We'll get to her in a minute, but first let's look at Ardipithecus cadaba. Ardipithecus cadaba was discovered by Johannes Haile Selassie and Tim White in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia. Cadaba has been dated to between 5.5 and 5.8 million years old, although there is a toe bone that is 5.2 million years old. That toe bone is particularly important because its shape indicates that Ardipithecus cadaba had the same ability to push off or toe off with its toes that humans have during upright walking. Like Auroran, it appeared from some hand and arm bones that Ardipithecus was also comfortable in the trees. This is consistent with the reconstruction of its environment as being quite forested. What's shown on this slide are the teeth of the species, which are very similar to the teeth of a chimpanzee on the left, in that upper left photo. And this indicates that Ardipithecus still had a weakly developed honing complex. However, there's also some wear on the apical region of the canines, which is more hominin-like, a derived trait. This has led the researchers to propose an intermediate perihoning complex in Ardipithecus cadaba. But a million years later, with Ardipithecus ramidus, the canines are apically worn like the teeth of other hominins, again, a derived trait. In 1994, an international team of researchers led by Tim White began discovering the remains of an adult female skeleton. She was different from anything anyone had ever seen or could possibly imagine. 15 years later, in 2009, her skeleton was revealed to the world in a series of scientific papers published in the prestigious journal Science. She was an Ardipithecus ramidus and lived in what was a forested environment in the Middle Awash region of Ethiopia a bit over 4.4 million years ago. In fact, because there were volcanic ash layers directly above and below her skeleton, she was quite precisely dated to 4.416 million years old, and it wasn't just her skeleton. The paleontologists working in this region discovered hundreds of hominin bones from dozens of different individuals. Of course, the highlight of these discoveries was the female partial skeleton, dubbed Ardi. What does Ardi tell us about human evolution at this time? Well, her brain is small, no bigger than that of a female chimpanzee, an ancestral trait. And like chimpanzees, she could climb trees, given the anatomy of her feet and hands. Again, an ancestral or primitive trait. But unlike apes, she had a non-honing canine. And again, this is a derived trait, or one that is changed, we believe that has changed since our last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos. There's also evidence from the pelvis, femur, and some aspects of Ardi's foot that when on the ground she moved on two legs. A study, and that, of course, is a derived trait in hominins. A study of the fossil animals and fossil seeds found near Ardi indicate that she would have lived in a forested environment. The Middle Awash research team examined carbon isotopes found in Ardi's teeth and concluded that she ate foods derived from C3 plant sources, which are found in forested environments. So these are plants like trees and herbs, not grasses, which are C4 plants. Of course, Ardi's big toe, which can be seen in the image on the right of this slide, is strong anatomical evidence that she lived in a forest and was fully capable of climbing trees. She has a big grasping toe that looks almost like that of an ape, so that's a primitive or derived trait. But the anatomy of the outside of Ardi's foot is more rigid and more human-like than the foot of an ape, providing some evidence that she was also capable of pushing off the ground while walking upright, and that's a derived trait. With this combination of ape-like abilities and human-like abilities, so primitive traits and derived traits, in many ways, Ardipithecus looks like an intermediate genus.